with testing serverless like any unit test. We'll have an option for or time for questions at the end. So if you can keep any questions till then, or just pop them in the chat function at the bottom of the page, Lewis will be able to run through them from there, and we'll go from there. Over to you, Lewis.
Cool. So I always like to start off my talks with a little interactivity, as one of my former colleagues will know. So let me just share my screen. You need to go to menti.com, and then you need to use the code to get into the quiz. So I am the QA lead at Cancer Research UK. So the quiz is themed on cancer research, things you didn't know. So yes, you can all join the quiz and then we'll get started. I thought as quizzes are so popular at the moment, then I can pop a little quiz in. There's only 3 questions and they're all multiple choice, so it shouldn't be too difficult. The way that the quiz works is there's a time limit, so make sure that you get your answers in before the time limit, and you get more points for the quicker you answer. So be quick as you can. We'll just give it a couple more seconds. Okay, let's go into question 1. I don't know how I've drawn on the screen here. How many people survive cancer thanks to cancer research? Four in 6, 2 in 6, or 3 in 6? Right, split. So the answer is actually 3 in 6. So through the research that cancer research has done, in 2010 we got to achieve the feat of 2 in 4 people survive cancer. So it's a really good thing. The next question is, how much do we spend in the year 2018 to 2019 just on research? So it's actually 546 million. So 80% of the fundraising and all the money that gets donated to cancer research actually goes to the research itself. So that's where that 546 figure comes from. And the final question, How many different types of cancer are there? Cool. Yeah, so there's actually more than 200 types of cancer, which is quite unbelievable when you think about it. Cool. So that's the quiz. There's actually a leaderboard, so you can see where everyone's ranked. Congratulations to the person with the most points. Well done. So let's get cracking. You didn't come here for a quiz, so let's start talking about testing in serverless. So my experience with serverless has been at Cancer Research. Lucky enough to work on a project which is working with the Genome Center, which is allowing us to compare cancerous DNA cells and work out if there's any kind of trend to cancerous DNA. So I'm Lewis Prescott. You can hit me up on any of the channels below. Create a little website if you want any consultancy work done. Only working 80% of the time due to COVID-19, so I've got a bit of free time to pick up any work if you need my services. We've done the quiz. So what is serverless? When I first started on the project, I was a bit worried about getting involved in the testing side because it was all a bit unknown, and also what does it actually mean? Because obviously it doesn't mean that there aren't servers. So how did I go about finding out how to test it? And I think one of the key things that I had to overcome at the time was understanding what it actually meant. And that led me obviously to what I'm going to talk about today. And it comes back to this glorious picture about the fact that the misconceptions of terminology in our field, obviously the cloud isn't actually a real thing. Servers have to be hosted somewhere. It's just about how you access them. And that's the same with serverless. So serverless is not about not having servers, but it's about being able to not worry about the maintenance of it, not worry about the hosting of it, and just worry about the actual events that you are working with. And when it's put in that granular terminology, it kind of makes sense. You're just running your services in a snippet of code, and that's all it is. So a simple example, you've got a web application which is interacting with AWS. It's storing something in an AWS bucket. Everything's a bucket in AWS land. And say we've got S3 bucket, which is just going to store us some files. That then triggers a lambda. And that lambda is what we want to test. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. So just take a minute to think about this diagram and think about the different ways that you would go about testing that. So the example that I'm going to talk about today is, as I mentioned, the Functional Genomics Center. We've partnered with AstraZeneca, which is a large organization in the world, and they've come up a lot in the COVID-19 space trying to develop a vaccine. So we're in partnership with them. They're working on developing the solution which processes the data that the scientists have created, and we are working on the infrastructure part of triggering the runs and outputting the data so that the scientists can interpret the results that they found. So how it looks, say that we have some genomic data which is related to COVID-19. It's stored in FTPS server, and we ingest that data into an S3 bucket. That is the raw data that the scientists have output in their specific data set. And then a lambda gets triggered. And that lambda transforms the data into another S3 bucket, which is in a more readable and more consumable manner, which then allows the data to be processed. So this is obviously not the whole solution. This is just a portion of it, but this is details how we're using lambda in a very simple way. So how do we go about testing that? So when I started on the project, I asked myself these questions. How are we going to trigger the events? We go back to the diagram I showed earlier. Usually it would be that someone uploads something into FTPS and we poll and we ingest it. But that's not very fast, and that relies on a data set. And the data set is gigabytes worth of data. So that's not really feasible. But yeah, an end-to-end test could perform us the action. We could put some sample data in there and wait for the lambda to trigger, and then once it's triggered, we could check the success of that lambda. But that wasn't really what I wanted. The other thing is our lambdas are written in Python, so we can access the code from that avenue using PyTest. And one of the things that we did at the start of the project was that we made sure that the lambda functions that we are writing are testable. So we want to make sure that the functions are split into single purpose, and we want to make sure that the lambda is as dumb as possible. All the lambda is doing is running specific Python methods, and we can test the methods individually and independently. And so we're pretty confident at that point in time that the lambda is functional. But what about the interactions with AWS? So the other question that we wanted to answer was, how do we get fast feedback? So when we're creating a pull request, we want to verify that our code is ready to go before we push it up to AWS and trigger a build. All of our AWS code is in CloudFormation, so spins up a new environment basically at a click of a button. So that was one of the things that we thought we could do, is set up a dev environment which allowed us to trigger the build the lambdas, and trigger an event. But again, it's quite slow and it's not as fast as we wanted. So unit testing. We knew that we could test our Python methods using PyTest. So why couldn't we do that with AWS lambdas as well? And the answer is we could. We're using Moto 3 API to interact with AWS itself. So we can mock those methods out and make sure that our code is working correctly. We're using Poetry to determine order dependencies, so we can run this in all different environments, and our code is stored in GitHub, so we can use things like GitHub Actions to run our tests. So this is where Moto comes in. So Moto is a package which allows you to mock out the AWS Moto 3 methods, which is a really nice feature, and it doesn't support all of the AWS AWS features, but it does the ones that we wanted. So this is a very simple piece of code which details how you would write a lambda in Python. So we're using an S3 bucket in this example, and once the event gets triggered, then we're iterating over the S3 client and getting the bucket name, and we're going to return that. So how does that look in terms of testing? So what you need to do in Moto is you need to create the buckets. So before the test starts, you need to make sure that your S3 bucket is there for your lambda to get called, because obviously we're relying on the S3 bucket to exist before our lambda function can get run. And the other thing that you want to do is mock out your event. So the event can get passed into your lambda handler function. And this allows you to test your handler easily. So going through the code here, what we're doing is we're creating a bucket in S3. We're putting an object inside the bucket, and then we're calling the lambda handler with the mock response, and then we're just verifying that the response has a body itself. So it's a simple unit test. We've mocked out everything that we need. It's as simple as that. You're just calling the lambda as you would any other function in your unit tests. So Moto has some good documentation on how to get started. So I'd recommend going through that. But yeah, I think the lessons that I've learned in doing this is not to be scared about terminology that you don't really understand. Actually, it's pretty simple in the back end. And the other thing is that keep it simple. So one of the things that we made sure we did was splitting out our code and truly making it single purpose. So the lambda testing isn't as important because you are testing the methods individually. And this isn't replacing your integration tests. You want to see this working in the real world. So ultimately, you still need to trigger the event in AWS and see that it's running end to end. But this allows you to test all the logic and test all your edge cases in your different scenarios. So yeah, that's a quick overview of my journey into discovering how to test lambdas using Moto. So Ashley, do you want to hand it over to the audience, see if we've got any questions?
Yeah, sure. So if there are any questions from anybody, then yeah, if we can just drop those into the chat box at the bottom, and Lewis will be able to go through those and answer them for you. Does anyone have any questions there for Lewis on those first points?
We got a question about integration testing. The answer is, I don't know. So I know that AWS has a CDK project which seemed like a really good solution for stuff like this, which allows you to test your infrastructure as code. So I think that would probably be the best way to go about doing that, is testing it through the CDK. That is something that is on our tech deck to have a look at and see if we can integrate that into our test suite. Are the unit tests available in GitHub? For reference, they're not because of the sensitivity of the project, but I can look at putting up a basic example of that S3 that I explained earlier. So yeah, I can definitely look at sanitizing some of the CR cancer research data and putting up an example. I can definitely do that in the next week or so. Yeah, again, got a question about allowing you to run on your dev machine, and the answer is I don't know. But yeah, that's definitely something that I can take away and get back to you, Neil.
There's a couple more just come through that.
Yeah, there's a really good question about lifespan and spawn on demand. So it's a really good question because in the size of data that we're using, obviously the processing can take a significant amount of time. So we have set the timeout and the memory to the max. And so that is definitely something that you need to consider when you are looking at your lambdas. And obviously then you would want to see if you could run some tests to determine your data sets. If you've got large data sets, make sure that you're testing the limits of those and make sure it's fit for those purposes. One of the things that we had to look at was lambdas comes with the retry. So we cache a lot of the data along the way. So that's one thing that you can consider is retrying and caching that information. Yes, and how close is the mocking to the real AWS APIs? So what Moto is doing in the background is it's actually spawning a kind of test instance for you. So it is a real life environment that you're working with, and we did have some issues with tripping over each other. So naming your buckets and things like that is important because you are working with a test environment. You need to make sure that your data is unique, or you're cleaning up your data after your tests. And that's something that PyTest can obviously help with in setup and cleanup. And the question goes on to talk about, did you find failures when the real AWS was launched? No, we didn't, is the answer to that. And that is due to the fact of making sure that our mocks are as similar as we can get to the real environment, and also making sure that we split out our code to make sure that we are testing all the edge cases up front. And another question about how did we decide upon Moto, and are there any other tools? Moto is the only one that I know of to be honest. It just came through searching for how to test lambdas, and Moto seemed to be the best option. We are using Moto 3. I don't know whether Moto supports older versions of Moto, to be honest. So yeah, I think hopefully I've answered everyone's questions, and yeah, I definitely recommend people playing around with it. You can create lambdas in the UI, so yeah, you can have a go, have a play yourself.
Yeah, perfect. I think yeah. So some obviously answered most of the questions there. I think there's one or two maybe to be carried away and looked at there, but I think there's one more just come in there. Have you encountered any performance issues with serverless, and is it really as elastic and scalable as it's supposed to be?
Yeah, so we did have limitations, as I said, about the memory and timeouts, and yeah, making sure that we are retrying and making sure that we are consuming the data in more of in smaller chunks was definitely something that we found, but we haven't had to worry too much yet with the scalability, because we've only released this to a couple of research sites at the moment. So yeah, and obviously with COVID-19, the research has kind of scaled down at this point in time, with directing our institutes to the COVID effort. So yeah, we haven't had to scale as much as we thought we would need to at the start of the project. So yeah, that's to be confirmed, I'm afraid. Neil, you've come with some really difficult questions. I used to work with Neil, so I can definitely get in contact with him, and he is always the one that asks all the difficult questions.
Yeah, no worries. Well, what I'll do is I'll save all of these questions anyway, and just for those ones that were going to be taken away, and we can obviously come back and obviously get those answered and share with the group at a later date as well. Yeah, I think that's everything for questions now. Yeah, anything further from your side there, Lewis?
No, I guess just a heads up that we were hiring up until COVID put a recruitment freeze. So when things go back to normal, then we will be hiring in the future. So if you're interested in coming to work for cancer research, then hit me up. Obviously connect with me on, you're going to share the slides, Ashley, I presume. So
yeah, we'll share the slides, and obviously the recording's going onto our YouTube channel, so I'll get that out this evening as well, and share that with the group, and obviously with all of our network via LinkedIn. You can share that with your network also, anyone else here as well. So yeah, I mean, thanks for the talk there tonight, Lewis. So as I say, I'll get that all shared out with everybody shortly. Any questions that anyone has coming away from this, feel free to reach out to Lewis or myself directly, and we can come back to you, or within the meetup page as well. And yeah, anybody else that's interested in talking in future, or if there's any other topics that you'd be keen to hear about, then let us know and we can look into that. We have got a few talks lined up for the next few Thursdays. Also, we've got one tomorrow lunchtime as well. So feel free to check the meetup page and log into that. But yeah, that's it from my side. Thanks again, Lewis, and yeah, speak to you all soon.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Bye.